Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The gunshot cracked before Elias Kestrel even saw her face. Dust exploded near his boot, and his horse reared beneath him, screaming. He rolled off the saddle and hit the dirt hard, palms scraping against broken glass from a shattered saloon window. Somewhere behind a rotted water trough, a woman's voice shook the silence. "Ride out now, or the next one finds your heart." Elias froze, hands raised, heart pounding against his ribs. Briarlow was supposed to be empty. Every map called it a ghost town. But ghosts, he was learning, did not reload rifles. He had ridden 3 days through dust and silence to reach Briarlow, chasing rumors of a hidden spring that never ran dry, even in drought. What he found instead was a town frozen in time, shop fronts sagging, a church bell rusted mid-swing, tumbleweeds gathered like mourners in the street. No footprints, no smoke. No reason for anyone alive to be here. Yet the shot had come from somewhere real, somewhere close, fired by hands that knew exactly how to miss on purpose. A warning, not a killing blow. Someone wanted him gone, not dead. That told him everything and nothing at all. "Show yourself," Elias called out, voice steady though his knees still trembled from the fall. Silence answered him, thick and deliberate. Then, slow and careful, a figure stepped from behind the trough. A woman, maybe 30 years old, sun-browned and lean, wearing a man's coat 3 sizes too large. Her rifle stayed leveled at his chest. Her eyes, though, told a different story than her weapon. They were exhausted, weary, and impossibly old for her face, like she had aged a decade in 3 years of watching the horizon for men who never stopped coming. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, each word clipped and careful, like she hadn't spoken aloud in longer than she wanted to admit. Elias kept his hands raised, studying her. The calluses on her fingers, the way she stood slightly angled to protect something behind her, the flicker of her gaze toward a cellar door, half buried under fallen timber. "Ma'am, I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly. "Just water and a place to rest." Her jaw tightened. "There's no water here, no rest either. Just get back on your horse and forget this town exists." But Elias Kestrel had spent 3 years forgetting things too. A wife's laughter, a daughter's small hand in his. A home that burned while he was 2 counties away, chasing another man's justice. He knew the sound of someone protecting a wound that never healed. He lowered his hands slowly, showing her his palms, empty and open. "I've got dried beef in a canteen," he said. "I leave both by that trough and ride to the ridge. You can shoot me from there just as easy, if that's what you decide." Her rifle didn't waver, but her eyes did. He turned his back, a foolish, deliberate risk, and started walking toward his horse. Behind him, he heard the cellar door creak, ever so slightly, as if something inside had shifted, waiting. A child's cough, quickly muffled. Elias stopped mid-step, every instinct roaring awake. 3 years alone in a dead town didn't explain a child's cough. It explained a secret far bigger than one frightened woman with a rifle. He turned back slowly, and for the first time, he saw real fear flash across her face. Not fear of him, but fear of what he'd just heard. "Please," she whispered, rifle finally lowering an inch, voice breaking on the single word. "Don't tell anyone we're here." Elias Kestrel stood in the dying light of Briarlow's empty street, staring at a woman who had survived 3 years inside a graveyard of buildings, guarding something the world believed was already dead. Whatever had happened here, whatever had driven her underground and kept her hidden, was far from over. And somewhere out past the ridge, riders were already watching the smoke that shouldn't exist, deciding what to do about the ghost town that had just impossibly come back to life. 3 years earlier, Briarlow had been a town of 82 souls, a mining settlement clinging to a hillside rich with silver and hope. Adaline Marsh had lived there with her husband Thomas and her infant son in a small house behind the blacksmith's forge. She remembered the town as loud and alive, children chasing chickens through the street, church bells calling families to Sunday supper, the smell of bread rising from Widow Calloway's oven each morning. It was not a wealthy place, but it was a whole, stitched together by people who had chosen each other when the world offered nothing else. Trouble arrived, wearing a fine coat and a friendly smile. A land baron named Warwick Sable rode into Briarlow, claiming he wanted to buy mining rights, offering fair prices and firm handshakes. But Thomas Marsh, who worked the assay office, discovered something Sable never intended anyone to find: forged deeds, stolen claims, silver quietly diverted from 3 neighboring towns into Sable's private ledgers for years. Thomas told only 2 people, the town's aging marshal and Adaline, late one night by candlelight, his voice trembling with the weight of what he'd uncovered. "This will end badly," he warned her. "Men like Sable don't apologize. They erase." The marshal was found dead within the week. His death ruled an accident, a fall from his horse that fooled no one who had seen him ride for 30 years without incident. Thomas grew quiet and watchful after that, sleeping with his rifle near the bed, teaching Adaline how to load and fire it herself. "If anything happens," he told her one evening, "you take our son and you run for the hills, not the road. Sable's men watch roads." She laughed nervously then, certain it was only fear talking. She did not yet understand how right he was to be afraid. The fire came on a moonless night in late October, 3 years before Elias Kestrel ever rode into Briarlow. Adaline woke to smoke and screaming, the sky glowing orange through her window like a second, furious sunrise. Riders moved through the streets with torches, systematic and silent, setting buildings alight one by one while townsfolk scattered in confusion and terror. Thomas shoved their infant son into her arms and pushed her toward the cellar trapdoor, hidden beneath their kitchen floor, a storage space he'd quietly reinforced for months, though he'd never told her why until that very moment. "Stay down, stay quiet, no matter what you hear," he told her, his face lit orange and terrible in the firelight. She begged him to come with her, clutching his sleeve, but he pulled free gently, kissing her forehead like a man memorizing something precious. "Someone has to slow them down," he said. "Someone has to give you time." Those were the last words Thomas Marsh ever spoke to his wife. She descended into darkness with her son pressed silent against her chest, and above her Briarlow burned while gunfire cracked through smoke-thick air, swallowing every scream the fire hadn't already taken. When the sound finally stopped, hours later, Adaline did not climb out. She stayed frozen in that cellar through sunrise, through the following day, listening to boots crunch over ash above her, men's voices confirming the town was empty, the job finished. She heard Sable's own voice among them, calm and satisfied, ordering his men to salt the wells so nothing would grow, so no one would return. It was only near midnight, when true silence finally settled, that she dared push open the trapdoor and step into the ruin that had once been her entire world. Everything was gone. Every house, every face, every voice she'd known since childhood. Thomas's body lay near the well, and she buried him herself before dawn with hands that would not stop shaking, using a shovel salvaged from the wreckage of the forge. She could have walked toward the nearest town for help. Instead, she looked at her sleeping infant son and understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that walking anywhere meant Sable's men would find them both. Briarlow was dead to the world now, and so Adaline Marsh decided, quietly and completely, that she would become a ghost within it. Survival, Adaline discovered, was not one decision, but 1,000 small ones, made daily, without rest. The cellar beneath her burned house became her first true home, cramped, dark, and smelling of ash for months, but hidden from any rider passing along the main road above. She rationed salvaged flour and dried beans scavenged from cellars across the ruined town, careful never to disturb dust or debris in a way that might catch a passing eye. She learned to move at dusk and dawn only, when shadows stretched long enough to hide a woman carrying water from the one well Sable's men had missed. Her son, whom she named Caleb after her late father, grew from infant to toddler inside walls of collapsed timber and scorched brick. She taught him to whisper before he learned to speak clearly, taught him that certain sounds, hoofbeats, wheels, distant voices, meant instant silence and stillness. It broke something in her, watching her child learn fear before he learned freedom, but the alternative, she believed completely, was far worse. Twice in that first year, riders passed through Briarlow's outskirts, and twice she pressed her hand over Caleb's mouth in the dark, praying his small heart wouldn't beat loud enough to betray them both. She rebuilt what she could without ever being seen from outside the town's borders, patching one sturdy building deep in the settlement's heart, planting a hidden garden behind collapsed walls where sunlight still reached, snaring rabbits with wire salvaged from the old fencing yard. She became something the townsfolk of Briarlow would never have recognized, silent, sharp-eyed, endlessly calculating. Every decision weighed against one question. Will this be seen? Will this bring them back? The woman who once sang while baking bread for neighbors had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone built purely for concealment and her son's survival. Word reached her, carried on rare whispers, from a traveling trader who occasionally left goods near the town's edge without ever entering, a kindness she never fully understood but desperately needed. Sable, the trader said, had grown richer and more powerful since Briarlow's destruction, buying up surrounding land at prices no honest man would refuse, always with the quiet implied threat of what happened to those who resisted. He had built himself into something untouchable, a respected rancher and rumored future territorial senator. The truth Thomas died protecting sat buried with him, and Adaline alone remained who could speak it aloud. That knowledge terrified her more than hunger, more than isolation, more than the constant ache of raising a child in shadows. If Sable ever learned survivors existed, learned that Adaline had heard him order the wells salted with her own ears, he would finish what the fire had started. So she stayed. Year after year, she stayed, watching Caleb grow taller in secret, watching her own reflection in a cracked mirror grow harder, more weathered, more like a woman carved from the same ash that surrounded her. She told herself it was temporary. Temporary became 1 year. 1 year became 3. By the 3rd year, Adaline had stopped imagining rescue. She had built traps along every approach to town, tripwires strung with bells, false trails leading nowhere, a warning system perfected through solitary trial and error. She had grown fast with a rifle, faster than she ever imagined a blacksmith's widow could become, out of pure necessity rather than choice. She no longer dreamed of leaving, only of surviving one more season, one more winter, one more year until Caleb was old enough to run swiftly on his own if the worst finally arrived at their door. Then, on an ordinary dust-choked afternoon, hoofbeats approached from the eastern ridge, slower than Sable's riders ever moved, alone rather than in the group of 6 or 8 his men always traveled in. Adaline gathered Caleb into the cellar out of pure habit, pressed her eye to a gap in the boarded window, and watched a single weary stranger ride directly into the heart of the town. Everyone believed was empty. Her hands trembled around her rifle, old instinct warring against something she hadn't felt in 3 long years, a flicker, faint and unwelcome, of desperate, dangerous hope. Elias Kestrel had not always been a drifter chasing rumors across empty territory. 5 years before Briarlow, he had worn a lawman's badge in a modest cattle town 200 miles east, married to a schoolteacher named Rosalind, and father to a daughter with his own stubborn chin. He remembered that life now only in fragments. Rosalind's laugh through an open window, his daughter's small boots by the door, the particular blue of a Tuesday sky before everything changed. He had been away serving a warrant when night riders, never identified, never caught, burned his home with his family inside it. He never found who did it. He chased false leads across 4 territories for years, following whispers into saloons and jailhouses, growing leaner and quieter with each dead end. Somewhere along that endless road, chasing ghosts that never materialized into justice, Elias had stopped calling himself a lawman and started calling himself nothing at all. Just a rider, just a man with a horse and a rifle and a hollow place where a family used to live inside him. When he'd heard rumors of a hidden spring near an abandoned mining town, he'd ridden toward it, mostly because riding was easier than staying still. Now, standing in Briarlow's ashen street, with a woman's rifle no longer quite pointed at his chest, Elias recognized something achingly familiar in Adaline Marsh's guarded eyes. The particular exhaustion of someone who had survived a fire that should have killed them, and had spent every day since paying for that survival in vigilance. He didn't know her story yet, not the details, but he knew its shape immediately, the way one grieving man recognizes another across a crowded, indifferent room. "I lost people too," he said quietly, before he'd fully decided to say it aloud. "To fire. To men who never answered for it." Something shifted in Adaline's expression. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the armor she'd worn for 3 unbroken years. She studied him a long moment, rifle finally lowering fully to her side, and made a decision she would question for days afterward. "There's a boy," she said simply, "my son. If you tell anyone this town isn't empty, both of us die. Not eventually. Soon." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she'd just handed him. Not just a secret, but a son's entire life, placed carefully into the hands of a stranger. She had every reason to still shoot. He camped that first night at the town's edge, respecting the invisible boundary she'd drawn, though he could see her small fire glowing faintly through gaps in a distant boarded window. Sleep came slowly, his mind circling questions he hadn't dared ask aloud yet. Who had burned this town? Why she believed they would return for a woman and child 3 years later? What kind of man inspired that particular undying fear? He thought of Rosalind, of his daughter, of the killers he'd never caught, and understood with sudden, sharpening clarity that he might finally be standing near an answer to a question he'd chased for years. Morning brought Caleb into view for the first time, a wary, wide-eyed boy of nearly 4, peering from behind his mother's coat with the particular stillness of a child raised to disappear on command. Elias crouched low, keeping his distance, and offered the boy a small carved horse he'd whittled during long nights on the trail, a habit from better days. Caleb didn't take it immediately, glancing up at his mother first for permission, and something about that small, careful gesture, a child asking if it was safe to want something, struck Elias harder than any gunfire ever had. Over the following days, Adaline told him fragments, testing his reaction with each piece, watching for any flicker of betrayal in his face. She told him about Thomas, about the forged deeds, about the marshal's convenient death, about the name that haunted her every waking hour, Warwick Sable. Elias went very still when he heard it, memory sparking sharp and sudden. He'd heard that name before, in a saloon 3 counties south, mentioned by men discussing a rising rancher turned politician with unusually deep pockets and unusually quiet enemies. The threads of 2 separate griefs, he realized, might be tangled around the very same man. Elias spent that evening staring into the fire, turning Sable's name over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop touching. He told Adaline what little he knew, that Sable had expanded his cattle empire dramatically in the past 3 years, buying failing ranches at suspiciously convenient moments, always after some unexplained tragedy weakened the previous owner's resolve to hold on to their land. He recalled a rumor, dismissed at the time as bar talk, about a mining town near the northern ridge that had simply vanished from maps, its silver claims quietly absorbed into Sable's growing territorial holdings without a single official inquiry. "That's this town," Adaline said flatly, feeding another stick into their small, carefully shielded fire. Briarlow's claims were folded into his paperwork within 2 months of the fire. I saw it myself on documents Thomas hid before he died. She explained how Sable had orchestrated everything with chilling patience, forged deeds establishing prior ownership, a fabricated story about renegade raiders responsible for the destruction, a narrative so complete and convenient that no territorial official had ever bothered investigating further. Justice, it seemed, was simply another resource Sable had learned to purchase, same as land, same as silence, same as fear. Elias felt old anger stirring beneath years of numb wandering, sharp and unwelcome. He had spent 5 years believing his family's killers were faceless strangers, unreachable and untraceable across an indifferent frontier. But listening to Adaline's account, he couldn't shake a growing terrible suspicion. What if his own tragedy hadn't been random either? What if Sable's pattern of convenient fires and vanished witnesses stretched further back than Briarlow, further than anyone had ever thought to connect? He didn't say this aloud yet, unwilling to burden her with a suspicion he couldn't prove. But the question settled into him like a splinter, working steadily toward bone. Days passed into a fragile, cautious rhythm. Elias helped reinforce Adaline's hidden dwelling, taught Caleb simple tracking games disguised as play, hunted quietly at the town's furthest edges to avoid depleting her carefully managed resources. Adaline, in turn, began speaking more freely, color slowly returning to her voice, worn thin by years of enforced whispering. She told him about Thomas's kindness, about the town's Sunday suppers, about a life stolen so completely that she sometimes forgot, for whole minutes at a time, that such warmth had ever truly existed. Elias listened, and in listening felt something in himself begin thawing after years of frozen grief. But danger never stayed distant for long in territory Sable controlled. On the sixth day, Elias spotted fresh hoofprints along the eastern ridge. 4 riders, moving deliberately, pausing periodically, as though scouting rather than passing through. He recognized the careful, unhurried pattern immediately. Men checking a location they suspected might not be as abandoned as reported. Someone, somewhere, had noticed something. Smoke rising at odd hours, perhaps, or supplies missing from a trader's inventory, or simply Sable's own paranoid instinct that a witness might have survived his fire after all these quiet, undisturbed years. He reported this to Adaline that night, watching old terror flood back into features that had only just begun softening. "They've come before," she admitted, voice tight. "Twice a year, maybe, just checking the ruins. They never stayed long, never found anything. But this time felt different, and both of them sensed it without needing to say so aloud. Elias had ridden into Briarlow, leaving a trail behind him, a trail 4 careful riders might easily follow back to a town everyone believed held nothing worth investigating. His arrival, meant as accidental rescue, might instead have become the very thing that finally exposed her. That night, Elias made a decision he didn't share immediately. If Sable's men were circling closer, waiting wouldn't save Adaline and Caleb. Only forcing the truth into daylight might. He thought of his own family's unanswered deaths, of Thomas Marsh's final sacrifice in a burning cellar doorway, of a boy who flinched at hoofbeats before he'd even learned his numbers. Somewhere between grief and fury, something in Elias Kestrel hardened into purpose for the first time in 5 aimless years. He would not simply protect this fragile, hidden family. He intended to finally end the man who had built an empire from other people's ashes. The 4 riders returned 3 days later, closer this time, their horses' hooves echoing unmistakably against Briarlow's cracked, empty streets. Elias watched from a collapsed rooftop, counting weapons, studying formations, recognizing the disciplined movement of men who'd done this kind of work before. Not soldiers exactly, but something adjacent, hired muscle, polished by repetition into something almost professional. Below him, Adaline had already pulled Caleb into the deepest section of their hidden cellar, rifle steady in her hands despite the fear Elias could see, even from a distance, tightening every line of her careful, controlled posture. The riders moved methodically through the ruins, checking buildings Adaline had deliberately left untouched to preserve the town's abandoned appearance, kicking through ash piles, calling out occasionally to each other in flat, businesslike tones. Elias recognized their leader by his posture alone, a broad-shouldered man named Garrick, whose reputation as Sable's most trusted enforcer had reached even the distant saloons Elias had wandered through over recent years. Garrick paused near the old well, studying salt crystals still visible along its rim, seemingly satisfied that whatever damage had been done here remained permanent, complete, undisturbed by any inconvenient survivors. Then Garrick's gaze shifted toward the eastern section of town, toward the one building Adaline had quietly, carefully maintained as livable. Elias's chest tightened as the enforcer dismounted, walking with unhurried confidence toward the very structure sheltering Adaline and her son. He had only seconds to decide, and instinct, sharpened by years of lawman's training he'd thought long abandoned, took over completely. Elias fired a single shot into the dirt near the riders' horses, not aimed to kill, but to startle, to redirect attention entirely away from that quiet building and squarely onto himself, standing exposed on the rooftop above them. "Looking for someone?" Elias called down, rifle now leveled directly at Garrick, voice carrying flat and hard across the empty street. The four riders wheeled instantly, weapons rising, and for one suspended, breathless moment, Briarlow's dead silence shattered into something sharp and dangerous. "This town's abandoned," Elias continued, forcing calm into his voice despite his racing heart. "You're wasting good daylight checking ash heaps. Nothing here but memories and rats." Garrick studied him carefully, clearly recalculating, clearly wondering whether this lone drifter was simply passing through or hiding something considerably more valuable than himself. "Mister, you're standing on private land," Garrick called back, tone carefully pleasant, despite four rifles now aimed upward. "Mr. Sable owns these claims. You'd best move along before we escort you off it personal." Elias forced something like a careless grin, keeping his own weapon steady. "Didn't see any fences, friend. Didn't see any signs either. Just an old goose town nobody's bothered rebuilding." Tension stretched taut between them, each side calculating odds, until Garrick finally slowly gestured his men back toward their horses, clearly unwilling to risk a fight over unclear territorial authority against a stranger who might simply be exactly what he claimed. But as they mounted, Garrick's eyes swept once more across the town, lingering a fraction too long on smoke curling faintly from a chimney Adaline had forgotten, in her fear, to fully extinguish. Elias saw the flicker of recognition cross the enforcer's face, quickly masked, but unmistakable. "We'll be back through," Garrick said, voice carrying deliberate warning now. "Sooner than you'd expect." They rode off toward the eastern ridge, unhurried, confident, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Elias climbed down immediately, heart pounding, knowing with sickening certainty that he had bought them time, not safety, and that time now was running out completely. Adaline emerged from the cellar white-faced, Caleb clutched tight against her chest, having heard every word exchanged above through gaps in the floorboards. "They saw the smoke," she said, voice trembling with the fear that 3 years of careful discipline could no longer fully contain. "They'll come back with more men. They'll burn everything, same as before. And this time, they won't stop until they're certain." Elias gripped her shoulders gently, forcing her attention away from spiraling panic and toward his own steady, determined gaze. "Then we don't wait for them to choose the moment," he said firmly. "We choose ours instead." The plan that emerged over the following anxious hours was dangerous, imperfect, and their only realistic option. Running blindly into open territory with a small child, pursued by riders who knew the land intimately, offered almost no chance of survival. Instead, Elias proposed something bolder, traveling to the territorial marshal's office in Cross Hollow. 2 days' hard ride south, carrying Thomas's hidden documents as undeniable evidence of Sable's forgeries and murders. If they could reach lawful authority before Sable's men reached them, the truth itself might finally become their strongest weapon after 3 long years of enforced, terrified silence. Adaline hesitated, old caution warring visibly against desperate hope. Every lawman within 100 miles has been paid off, threatened, or replaced by Sable's own men, she said. Memories of her town's original marshal's convenient death still sharp and painful. Why would Cross Hollow's marshal be any different? Elias explained what he'd learned during years of drifting, that a new federal marshal had recently taken the post, a man named Obadiah Reyes, known specifically for refusing bribes that had corrupted 3 predecessors before him. It wasn't certainty, only possibility, but possibility was considerably more than they'd had an hour earlier. That night, they prepared quickly and quietly, gathering Thomas's carefully preserved documents from their hiding place beneath a loose cellar floorboard, packing minimal supplies, saddling Elias's horse alongside one Adaline had kept hidden and fed in a ravine outside town for exactly this kind of desperate emergency. Caleb, sensing the tension surrounding him despite his young age, stayed unusually quiet, small hand gripping tight to the carved wooden horse Elias had given him days earlier. "We ride before dawn," Elias said, checking his rifle one final time, "before Garrick's men expect anyone capable of leaving to actually try." Adaline paused before mounting, turning back toward the ruined town that had been both her prison and her only remaining shelter for 3 impossibly long years. Something complicated crossed her weathered features. Grief, certainly, but also something unexpected beginning to surface beneath it. Relief, faint and fragile, at finally choosing motion over frozen, endless waiting. "Thomas would want this," she whispered, mostly to herself. "He didn't die, so we could just keep hiding forever." Elias said nothing, simply nodded, understanding completely the particular weight of finally honoring someone lost by refusing to remain permanently, safely invisible. They rode out just before first light, hooves muffled with cloth wrapping Adaline had prepared for exactly this purpose. Moving through unfamiliar southern trails Elias had scouted carefully during his days in town. Behind them, Briarlow's broken silhouette faded slowly into morning mist. 3 years of hidden survival now left behind for a desperate gamble on distant justice. Caleb slept against his mother's chest, unaware how much rested on this single ride. Elias scanned the horizon constantly, rifle within easy reach, aware that Garrick's warning had not been idle threat, but genuine promise, and that promise, sooner rather than later, would surely be kept. They were 3 hours into open country when Elias first spotted dust rising along the northern trail behind them. Riders moving fast, clearly following tracks, rather than searching blindly. He counted at least 6 shapes through the shimmering heat, more than Garrick had brought to Briarlow originally, suggesting Sable had committed considerably more resources upon learning his secret might finally be unraveling. "They're gaining," Adaline said grimly, glancing back while keeping Caleb steady against her. Elias pushed their horses harder, choosing rougher terrain deliberately, gambling that familiarity with these particular hills might slow pursuers unfamiliar with anything beyond Sable's immediate ranch land. The chase stretched across brutal sun-scorched hours, both horses lathering with exhaustion, Caleb finally waking and beginning to cry from fear and discomfort, despite his mother's desperate, whispered reassurances. Elias led them through a narrow rock passage he remembered from earlier drifting years, hoping to buy critical distance. But Garrick's men knew this land better than he'd anticipated, cutting across a shorter route that brought them dangerously, alarmingly close by late afternoon. Gunfire finally erupted as they broke from the passage into open plain, bullets kicking dust dangerously near their horses' pounding hooves, forcing both riders into a desperate, weaving gallop toward distant, hazy hills. Elias returned fire over his shoulder, more to discourage close pursuit than with any real hope of hitting anything at full gallop, while Adaline pressed Caleb's small body protectively low against her saddle. One bullet struck Elias's horse's flank, not fatally, but enough to make the animal stumble badly, nearly throwing him before he regained desperate control. "We can't outrun 6 riders on tiring horses," he shouted across the gap between them, mind racing through rapidly narrowing options. Ahead, a shallow river cut across their path, dangerous to cross at speed, but potentially their only remaining chance to break pursuit before Cross Hollow's distant, still unreachable safety. They plunged into the river together, cold water shocking exhausted horses into fresh, adrenaline-fueled effort, current pulling hard against them as gunfire continued cracking from the bank behind. Adaline screamed as her horse stumbled on unseen rocks beneath the surface, nearly unseating her and Caleb both. But Elias reached across the gap, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise, steadying them both through the crossing's most dangerous, chaotic moment. They emerged on the far bank, soaked and shaking, horses blowing hard, Garrick's men pausing at the water's edge, apparently unwilling to risk the same dangerous crossing at full pursuit speed themselves. "That buys us maybe 20 minutes, Elias gasped, urging their exhausted horses onward regardless, unwilling to trust even that fragile advantage for long. Cross Hollow's distant rooftops finally became visible against darkening evening sky, still agonizingly far but tangible now, in a way it hadn't been through hours of desperate flight. Caleb had stopped crying entirely, gone silent and wide-eyed, with an exhaustion no child his age should ever have to know, small fingers still gripping his wooden horse with white-knuckled desperation throughout the entire brutal chase. They reached Cross Hollow's outskirts just as full darkness settled, horses stumbling with exhaustion, riders finally slowing, as scattered lantern light and distant voices signaled genuine civilization ahead for the first time in 3 years for Adaline. But Garrick's men, though slowed by the river crossing, hadn't abandoned pursuit entirely. Elias could still hear distant hoofbeats somewhere behind them, patient and relentless, clearly intending to finish this before any marshal's office could intervene. They had reached the town, but reaching it, Elias understood grimly, was only the very beginning of tonight's desperate, still unfinished fight. Marshal Obadiah Reyes met them at his office door, with a raised lantern and a raised eyebrow, taking in their exhausted, soaked, and clearly terrified appearance, with the calm assessment of a man who'd seen desperate arrivals before. Elias explained quickly, urgently, thrusting Thomas's preserved documents into the marshal's steady hands, while Adaline clutched Caleb close behind him, watching the street beyond for any sign of pursuing riders. Reyes studied the forged deeds carefully by lantern light, expression hardening with each page, clearly recognizing names and patterns that matched suspicions he'd apparently been quietly building himself since arriving at his post months earlier. "I've heard Sable's name before," Reyes admitted grimly, setting the documents down with deliberate care. Complaints I couldn't previously prove, ranchers who sold suspiciously fast, a marshal's death, 2 territories overruled, convenient accident. This, he tapped the forged deeds firmly. This finally gives me something solid to act on. Before he could continue, gunfire erupted outside. Garrick's men had arrived, apparently deciding boldness now outweighed caution. 6 riders forming a rough line across Cross Hollow's main street, clearly intending to finish their mission regardless of witnesses or consequences within town limits itself. Reyes moved fast, despite his measured demeanor, grabbing his own rifle while shouting orders to 2 deputies emerging hastily from adjacent buildings. Get the woman and child inside the jailhouse, reinforced walls, he commanded, already moving toward the door himself. Elias followed close behind, adrenaline overriding exhaustion completely, while Adaline reluctantly allowed a deputy to guide her and Caleb toward the jailhouse's thick stone walls, rifle still gripped tight in her own trembling hands despite the deputy's protective escort. The confrontation that followed unfolded fast and brutal across Cross Hollow's darkened street, lit only by scattered lanterns and muzzle flashes. Garrick, seeing Reyes's badge and understanding immediately the danger of open violence against federal authority, tried retreating with his remaining men. But Reyes's deputies had already positioned themselves to block the street's northern exit entirely. "Stand down," Reyes shouted, voice carrying clear command across the chaos. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marshal Aldous Finch and the destruction of Briarlow Township." Garrick hesitated, clearly calculating odds now stacked heavily against him, before, finally, grudgingly lowering his weapon, 4 of his men following suit immediately, while 2 others fled into darkness, abandoning their leader entirely rather than face certain capture. In the sudden, ringing quiet that followed, Elias found Adaline in the jailhouse doorway, Caleb still pressed tight against her, both watching the street with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and exhausted, fragile relief. "It's not over," Reyes admitted honestly, joining them moments later, wiping dust from his weathered face. Sable himself is still free, still powerful, still capable of buying his way clear of everything Garrick might say against him. Adaline's face tightened with old familiar fear, 3 years of hard-won caution, refusing to simply dissolve after one single night's dangerous victory, however significant. "But," Reyes continued, holding up Thomas's carefully preserved documents, "these deeds, combined with sworn testimony from you and from Garrick himself, once he understands his own precarious position, gives me finally enough to ride against Sable directly, with full territorial authority behind me." Elias watched something shift slowly in Adaline's exhausted features. Not complete relief, not yet, but something close to it. Something she perhaps hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 long hidden years. For the first time since Briarlow burned, justice felt less like a desperate, impossible hope, and considerably more like an approaching, tangible reality. 3 weeks later, Warwick Sable stood trial in Cross Hollow's newly built courthouse. Garrick's detailed testimony combined with Thomas Marsh's preserved documents, forming an evidence chain even Sable's expensive lawyers couldn't fully dismantle. Adaline testified herself, voice steady, despite visible trembling, describing the night Briarlow burned in careful, devastating detail, while Sable sat silent and pale at the defendant's table, his careful reputation finally, completely unraveling before an entire courtroom's watching eyes. The jury deliberated only briefly. Sable was sentenced to hang for murder and arson, his vast landholdings seized and slated for return to their rightful, surviving former owners across the territory. Elias stood at the back of that crowded courtroom throughout the entire trial, watching Adaline finally speak truth aloud after 3 years of enforced, terrified silence, and felt something long frozen within himself beginning, slowly, to thaw completely. During recess one afternoon, he finally shared his own suspicion with Marshal Reyes that his own family's unexplained fire, 5 years earlier and 2 territories distant, matched Sable's established pattern precisely. Reyes promised a full investigation, and though certainty would take months longer to establish completely, Elias felt, for the first time in 5 wandering years, that justice for Rosalind and his daughter might finally, genuinely be within reach. Adaline and Caleb remained in Cross Hollow through the trial's conclusion, staying in a small boarding house room Marshal Reyes had personally arranged, slowly, carefully relearning what it meant to exist without constant, exhausting vigilance. Caleb, now nearly 4, began speaking louder, laughing more freely, no longer instinctively flinching at every unexpected hoofbeat or raised voice passing beneath their window. Adaline herself changed visibly too, color and strength gradually returning to features long hardened by isolation and fear, though certain habits, checking windows, sitting with her back towards solid walls, would clearly take considerably longer than 3 short weeks to fully release. Briarlow's returned land, freed from Sable's fraudulent claims, technically belonged to Adaline now as Thomas's surviving widow, though rebuilding an entire burned town alone seemed an impossible, overwhelming prospect. Elias, having finally released years of aimless wandering, now that genuine purpose had replaced empty grief, offered quietly to help her rebuild rather than simply riding onward toward his next distant destination. "I've got nowhere else I need to be," he told her one evening, watching Caleb chase fireflies across the boarding house's small back garden with unrestrained, delighted laughter. Neither of them had heard from him previously. Adaline smiled, genuinely, for what felt like the very first time. They returned to Briarlow together that following spring, bringing lumber, tools, and, eventually slowly, other families willing to resettle land, finally freed from Sable's corrupting shadow. The old well was cleared and reopened, its salted earth finally, patiently restored through careful seasons of labor. The church bell, salvaged from ash and carefully repaired, rang again for the first time in over 3 years, calling a small but genuinely growing community together each Sunday. Adaline planted a proper garden in open sunlight now, no longer hidden behind broken walls, and taught Caleb to speak at full, unguarded volume, his childhood fear gradually replaced by something closer to ordinary, well-earned joy. Elias never fully stopped searching for definitive answers about his own family's fire, but he stopped searching alone. Reyes's investigation eventually confirmed what Elias had long suspected: an earlier, smaller version of Sable's exact pattern, predating even Briarlow, finally providing something resembling closure after 5 unanswered years of wandering grief. He built a small house near Adaline's rebuilt one, close enough for Caleb to run freely between them each morning, far enough to respect the careful, patient pace with which 2 people healing from separate fires learned, slowly, to trust something as fragile and hopeful as a shared future. By the following autumn, Briarlow bore little resemblance to the silent, ash-choked ruin Elias had first ridden into. Smoke rose openly now from a dozen rebuilt chimneys, no longer something to fear or hide, but simple, ordinary evidence of families cooking supper as evening settled gently over restored streets. Adaline stood some evenings at her doorway, watching Caleb play openly in streets that once demanded his complete, terrified silence, and felt something she'd nearly forgotten how to recognize: peace, hard-won and entirely real. 3 years of hiding had ended not in tragedy, but in something far rarer across that unforgiving frontier: a town and a family, finally, fully alive again. The Hentide.